As far as Jake was concerned, Chase's life was as good as over. He'd seen prisoners beaten to a bloody pulp for lesser offences, but he knew full well that Chase had simply had it. He wasn't putting up with the insults and humiliation any longer. If they wanted to kill him, he was willing for that, so long as he kept his self-respect. Jake often felt this way, but never acted on it. The enraged guard struggled to unhook his steel scabbard and began flailing it with furious swipes at Chase, who shuffled and darted to evade each stroke. Now the other guards and prisoners gathered into a loose circle, each silently rooting for their man. Amazingly, no matter how hard or how fiercely the guard swung his scabbard, he simply couldn't connect with the nimble American. Finally, another guard reached out to grab the scabbard, only to have his hand whacked in the process, and the melee ended just as quickly as it had begun. Jake felt like his heart was going to pound out of his chest. Breathing heavily, Chase picked up his mop and bucket under a crowd of intensely staring eyes and sauntered back to his cell as if nothing had happened. Everyone slowly went back to their business. Jake was shocked. It seemed that Chase's defence of his buddy and standing up for himself despite the possibly horrendous consequences earned him the respect of the guards. One even nodded with a grin. They never mentioned the matter again. August 1943. The Andrus Farm, Madras, Oregon. The 6 family members unfolded their hands, having just given thanks for their food in prayer before a lavish display of corn on the cob, mashed potatoes and gravy, and meatloaf on the checkered tablecloth. A basket of steaming rolls and plate of green beans sat beside a pitcher of milk. Maybe they weren't rich, Mrs. Andrus thought, but they had all they needed. She passed a basket of rolls to Helen, her youngest, who looked up and said, "I wonder what Jake's eating tonight." The room went silent. Ruth looked down at her empty plate. After a few moments, she folded her red and white napkin and laid it across her plate. I'm just not too hungry tonight. I need to do some paperwork." She slid her chair back and excused herself. Mrs. Andrus nodded with understanding and looked around the table. Jake's absence and uncertainty left a huge hole in their family. After a few more seconds of silence, Glenn pushed away as well. "I can't eat." One at a time, each one left without touching the food. Mrs. Andrus understood. She felt the same way and tried to hold back the water that stood in her eyes. 1943. Keuka College, New York. Peggy peered up at the double string of Canadian geese in a V formation flying over and followed them across the southern sky as they honked and flapped through the autumn air. As she meandered past students lying on the grass to her favourite bench near the lake, she unfolded a worn letter, worn from the number of hands it had passed through before finally reaching her. She couldn't wait as she walked and read. "My dear children," the letter began. She could hear her mother's voice in every handwritten word. "We are living in the jungle with the monkeys. We have just finished rethatching our roof because the old one was leaking like a sieve. We have lots to eat, thanks to the Filipinos. We even drink milk from our water buffalo. We live just like the locals. Every day we eat rice and vegetables. We often have our meals with Signa, Dorothy, and the Round family. Mr. and Mrs. Meyer and the Adams live nearby, but everyone else was captured and they're being held in Iloilo and in Manila. I think they're treated okay." Finding her bench and sitting down overlooking the lake, she grimaced at the thought of her friends in prison and wondered what it must be like. She wondered if they would survive. "The Japanese soldiers came near here 3 times. Frank Rose even heard their voices. The last time they came near our house, your father was at the Myers' place. I grabbed a few of our belongings and hid. I was so frightened I almost thought I was done for." Peggy watched a canoe paddled by 2 student couples gently slosh past her. She'd never seen her parents be anything but strong. She just couldn't picture either of them being afraid. Of course, if she'd been there, she thought, she'd have been terrified. In order to buy food, we sold our tablecloths, sheets, and some clothing. The University Chapel Hall and the staff residences were burned down, and many of the other buildings were destroyed or looted. We heard that the mission hospital in Iloilo City is being used by the Japanese army. Ida's 4 girls came to visit us walking 11 kilometers. We heard that they have moved 23 times. Their father is an American, and Virginia was caught by the Japanese army because her father was in the communication unit. She shuffled to the next sheet and looked at some of the other students, wondering if anyone she knew could understand what was going on in the war. It all seemed so far away to everyone, just headlines in newspapers with no faces. I always pray for you. I just wonder what you're doing right now. I wish I could see you. However, I don't want to travel until there is peace again. With lots of love, Mother. Peggy wondered what her mother and father were doing right then as well. She couldn't wait to see them again and for the whole war to be over. She folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and wiped her coat sleeve across her eyes, hoping no one would notice. September 1943. Yokosuka Naval Base, Tokyo Bay. Leaning on his crutches in front of Vice Admiral Kakuta's desk, Fuchida felt like a patron intruding on a salesman exasperated by customers. Kakuta flipped sheets of paper, then dropped a set into a file cabinet. He never looked up as he quickly signed papers. By the end of the year, I expect we'll be sending over 1,000 planes to the Philippine Islands. Bases need to be prepared. Collapsing papers into a folder, he finally looked up at Fuchida and held the heavy portfolio toward him. We're sending you to locate abandoned U.S. bases we can rebuild and to locate sites for new ones. It was a welcome assignment for Fuchida, who was anxious to get back into the field and away from a desk, but even more, he'd become alarmed at the expansion of Japanese installations without the adequate build-up of air support. His pilots had to fly to their maximum limit to protect their soldiers on the ground and badly needed more bases. He took the folder and stuck it under his arm. "Can you fly?" Kakuta said bluntly. Fuchida grinned as he looked at his crutches. "Yes, sir. No problem there." His casts were off, but his ankles were still a bit weak. "Good. Get to work." The Vice Admiral spun around and dialed out on the phone as if Fuchida had already left. During his 5.5-hour flight to the Philippines, high above the ocean in his B-5N bomber with his pilot and radio man, Fuchida had time to reflect. The Americans could never be defeated. This was now an overwhelming fact, but he was sure they could at least be stopped. All Japan had given up were some relatively unimportant islands on the outer edges of their expanse. He unconsciously shook his head. It seemed a shame to him that half of the more than 1,000 aircraft being manufactured each month were being diverted to the war in China. But if Japan's Pacific forces pulled back into a defendable posture, doubled up their perimeter divisions, and exacted enough casualties, the American public would soon tire of the bloodletting and call their men back home. What were the Americans fighting for, anyway? They had nothing to gain. Their country was safe. Japan was fighting for its very survival. America should know this. He looked down as they passed over Okinawa. Clouds like sheets of cotton balls floated against green mountains. The Americans were in for a surprise, he thought. When the Philippines were taken over, they were liberated as well, liberated from the colonization of Western powers. The American soldiers on the island were taken captive, but the Filipino soldiers were set free, tens of thousands of them. Now, he was convinced, they would taste life under the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, free from the white race. More and more they'll see themselves in a new light and cast in their lots with the Japanese against the Americans. Fuchida grinned. Why wouldn't they? "The Philippine Islands. There's beer in the icebox," the base commander said as Fuchida sat down on a green-stuffed couch and put his hands behind his head. He wasn't expecting such nice accommodations. "I don't think the locals will ever consider themselves a part of Greater East Asia," Fuchida said. The host gave a single chuckle. "They hate us." Fuchida's 2-week mission took him first to Manila, where he discussed his plans for 15 air bases with the regional commander of Japan's naval forces. Over the course of a few days, he selected locations for 5 bases in the area and then headed about 60 miles south to Batangas, where he found locations for 2 more bases. His ankles had finally healed enough that he could happily discard his crutches. From there he flew to Legazpi, on the southeastern end of the main island of Luzon, where he had a chance to walk the streets with his flying companions and mix with the locals. He smiled at passers-by with a friendly touch to his hat, only to receive cold stares. Strange. Picking up a pineapple at a vendor's stand to smell the fresh scent, he felt the steely glare of the people. Others across the street stood still. Even with the temperature being a sweltering 101 degrees, he felt like he'd been doused in ice water. It was the same in every city he visited. Why? After establishing 2 more air bases in Legazpi City the day before, Fuchida's plane touched down on a dirt strip beside a base at the last location to scout, Cebu City on the large island of Cebu. He and his weary crew were escorted to a white guest house with black shutters and white porch railings, where they could finally remove their boots and stepped into the house in their stocking feet. Fuchida sat on a couch and leaned forward to examine the magazines on the table. Booklets, really, all picturing General MacArthur on the cover with bold red block letters stating, "I shall return." He leafed through the pages of articles and photographs of American landing parties, Japanese ships exploding in the ocean, and dead Japanese half buried on sandy beaches. "Where did these come from?" The host handed a newly opened bottle of cold beer to Fuchida's pilot. "From the guerrillas. The booklets are all over the islands." He threw back a swig. Fuchida winced. "How are these coming in? Airdrops?" The commander shook his head. "Submarines." Fuchida sighed. If they could smuggle in booklets, they were certainly smuggling in weapons. He let the magazine close to the cover of MacArthur with his oversized corncob pipe. "MacArthur?" Fuchida muttered. The commander walked to the window and pulled back the white lace curtain, muffling a belch. "There's nothing to worry about from him. He's a coward. He left his men to die alone." Fuchida stood up with the magazine in hand and tapped the photo. "He didn't say his army would return. He said, 'I shall return.' He gives people the will to keep on fighting." The commander turned from the window and smiled, folding his arms and bending his neck a bit. "He's happy eating bacon and eggs in Australia. He'd just as soon—" "He put his own honour at stake." The room went quiet. Fuchida dropped the magazine to the table with a slap. He spoke more quietly, but with greater conviction. "He will certainly be back." Fuchida knew that the most dangerous thing the Americans were smuggling in was hope. The next day they flew back north to Manila, where he would give his report to the area commander. His journey high above the lush islands and glittering blue ocean was a pleasant reprieve from the concerns of war. Looking down onto the island of Panay, Fuchida reflected on the overwhelming beauty he'd seen in the past few days, beauty like he'd never seen before. The flourishing vegetation seemed engulfed by brilliant flowers of yellow, white, and pink. He was tiring of war and looked forward to the day the war would be over. In the jungle mountains below, Jimmy hacked away with a machete at the base of a thick stalk of bamboo when the distant drone of a lone airplane caught his attention in the sky above. Seeing the bright red Hinomaru on the wings of the bomber, he turned back to hacking angrily, longing for the day the war would be over. October 1943, Hope Vale, the Philippines. A sweaty, wounded Filipino fighter with a rag tied to his head for a hat, the top of his shirt peeled down to his waist, sat biting a cigarette as one of the Hope Vale refugees, Jenny, the camp nurse, finished wrapping his shoulder in gauze. She pulled aside some strands of her hair stuck to her perspiring face. "Not a whole lot of sense in anyone fixing you up," she said. if you're planning on killing yourself with that coffin nail in your mouth." She glanced up at his smiling face, then tore the end of the gauze strip with her teeth and tied it into a knot. "It's all right, missy. Cigarettes don't kill you until the end of your life." She nodded without smiling. "I'll be sure to have them put that on your gravestone." She took a last look at his shoulder. "Come back in 2 days and we'll have a look." The gorilla shrugged his shirt back on and started buttoning up as an American gorilla stepped up and displayed a gash on his hip with a smile. In the open-air church under the outstretched wings of the forest canopy, Jimmy read to a gathering of expectant brown and white faces sprinkled with sunlight. The people focused on every word. "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbour and hate your enemy,'" Jimmy said. Everything he lived for seemed wrapped up in these words that had become his life. "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he causes his sun to rise on the evil." Jimmy suddenly looked to the backwoods that rustled and parted, revealing an armed Japanese officer and soldier. "And on the good." Jimmy closed his Bible. The entire group of 65 people turned and fixed their eyes on the uninvited visitors. Jimmy was petrified, but didn't show it. His heart raced. They'd seen Japanese in the distance, but never inside their camp. Just like everyone else in the area, he'd heard the terrifying rumors of the new Japanese leader on the island, and how he and his men tortured and killed just to put people into a state of fear. It was working. "We have guests. You are all dismissed." He couldn't imagine what would happen next. The penalty for not turning yourself into the camps was death. Period. The people cautiously began to rise, but the Japanese officer headed toward the front and held both hands up as he walked, leaving his pistol in its holster. "Suare," he said, then again in English. "Sit down." The snap of fallen twigs beneath the officer's boots seemed deafening to Jimmy as the officer made his way to where he stood at the front. The other soldier remained at the rear, his rifle drawn. Every head followed the officer with a mixture of fear and amazement. He carefully looked Jimmy in the face, then turned to the people and walked to those in the front row, Chalmer, Jenny, Frank, Gertrude, and the others. The officer reached into a breast pocket. Jimmy watched, prepared to see anything but was unprepared to do anything. They'd been caught flat-footed. There was nothing to do but to watch and wait. The officer withdrew a tied roll of paper, loosened the string, and proceeded to peel off 10-centavo notes, passing them out freely, walking among the rows silently. The people graciously accepted the currency, almost as if they were receiving communion wafers from a priest, each nodding with thanks and a fearful smile. Reaching the back, he turned to face Jimmy and stood stationary for what seemed a very long time, but was only a few moments. His eyes connected with Jimmy's, then turned downward for a second. Even though Jimmy knew many were swept up in nationalistic pride, he'd met others in Japan who simply felt pushed into the war. He could see in this young officer's face the shame of the association with his military and what they were doing. He felt sorry for him. The officer bowed, stood upright, and just as he began to turn, Jimmy shouted out in Japanese, "We're all one blood!" The officer was shocked to hear a white person speak perfect Japanese. "We're all brothers," Jimmy said, again in Japanese. November 1943. The island of Panay, the Philippines. His eyes smiled back as he said in Japanese, "We didn't see anything here today." Then, just as abruptly as he had appeared, he and the other soldier just as suddenly were enveloped by the foliage and disappeared. Howling and sobbing uncontrollably on their knees in the muddy street, 2 Filipino women and 7 children begged for mercy as 2 Japanese soldiers propped up the bloody mess of a Filipino man between them. Behind them, soldiers tossed belongings out of the window of a hovel into the street. Petrified townspeople gaped from a distance as watchful armed infantrymen stood around Captain Watanabe. Several headless bodies lay in a heap against a blood-spattered wall. Watanabe grabbed the Filipino's hair and jerked his head up. "I swear I don't know where their hideout is," the man blurted out in Ilongo. "They forced me to help them. I swear I don't know." Watanabe turned to a Filipino translator who spat out the words in Japanese. "Liar!" Watanabe threw the man's head back down. The pattern was the same wherever Watanabe went. Random people tied up, beaten, and stabbed with bayonets to extract information. Not getting what they wanted, soldiers selected others, perhaps family members or friends or children. Some were hung upside down and set on fire to instill terror. Culminating in total frustration, nearly everyone in the area could be executed. In the prior 2 weeks, Watanabe and his men had slaughtered over 2,000 civilians. "I'll teach them not to lie to me! Blindfold him!" Watanabe's eyes flared with an insane fury. Another soldier wrapped a rag for a blindfold around the man's head as he was pushed to his knees and continued his vain pleadings for mercy. The women convulsed in shrieks as Watanabe unsheathed his sword and took his stance, slowly raising his katana above his head, completely deaf to the wailing of the horrified women. The paradise island of Panay had become the island of mud and blood. Early December 1943, Nanking, China. Alerted by the echo of hammers pounding nails in the courtyard, Jake braced his hands and feet on opposite walls of his wooden cell, and, as was his habit, shimmied his way, inch by inch, to the top of his cell, where he strained to peer through the slit to investigate. The guards were completing work on some kind of wooden box. To Jake, it pretty much looked like a coffin. He braced his arms and legs extra hard as he felt a weakness shoot through his bones. Confused, fearful and angry, he carefully shimmied his way back down. He slumped to the floor, letting his head fall into his hands in a daze. If someone wasn't dead already, he soon would be. Whatever was going on, it was very, very bad. The next day, his latch clicked and the wooden cell door creaked open. Jake narrowed his eyes into the light. 2 guards and the camp warden stood tall, dressed in new uniforms, something he hadn't seen before. Jake got to his feet and was escorted toward the cell of Bob Meader. Jake glanced at the guards who wouldn't look him in the eyes. It was always a bad sign when the guards wouldn't look him in the eye. They stopped near the entrance of Bob's cell and let Jake walk forward on his own. He took a few tentative steps and leaned to peer into the dark chamber. The room gave off the odd scent of a sawmill, a latrine, and a flower shop. Stepping inside, he looked down on the gaunt, peaceful body of Bob lying in the raw wood coffin, a wreath of white flowers on his chest. It wasn't a total surprise, as Jake had seen his life slowly ebb away. Still, to see his friend dead was shocking. On the other side of the floor lay the lid of the coffin with a Bible neatly placed in the centre. Jake studied Bob's peaceful face. To him, Bob was a true gentleman, a prince of a man. When his plane went down in the water on the coast of China, he nearly drowned trying to save the lives of 2 of his crewmates. That was Bob. He could have just looked out for himself, but he wasn't that kind of a guy. He deserved better than to be treated like a piece of rotting meat by half-human captors for the past year and a half. His death was meaningless. As Jake wiped the water from the edge of his eye, a cloud of silent rage descended on him. His head trembled as he breathed more deeply, and the vessels in his neck began to pound. One last time, he looked at Bob's face, leaned down, and whispered through clenched teeth, "I hope every damn Jap is wiped off the face of the earth." He turned toward the door and shuffled out into the hallway, glaring at the guards one at a time, who seemed to stare at the horizon. Then he looked down at the floor, breathing hard, trying to restrain himself from any show of the burning hatred he felt. That night, back in his cell with the evening stars providing only the barest hint of dark blue light, Jake sat against the wall under a tattered blanket, nearly hyperventilating and trembling violently, from the biting cold and from the boiling fury that raged in his heart and coursed through his veins. Pure, distilled hatred. Tokyo, Japan. Emperor Hirohito spun around from his office window. Dead! How could you let him die? The commander remained in a deep bow. Your Majesty, it couldn't be helped. We have spoken to the prison leaders in order to see that— Don't dare let another Doolittle prisoner die. We may need them later. We can't afford to lose another. The Emperor looked away angrily. Do whatever you need to do. Yes, Your Majesty, we will. 1 week later, Nanking, China. Jake proudly puffed on a cigarette as he walked the yard and eyed George, who was seated on a bench opposite the prison warden, who nodded and rapidly took notes. George kept blabbing on with his Brooklyn accent. Bread, butter, jam, steak, eggs, potatoes, milk, ice cream. You got this? Eggs, the warden repeated back. Milk and ice cream. And we need to eat 3 times a day, not 2 times. No more of that? Meals. 3 times. And we're going crazy in here too. We need something to read. You know, books, magazines, newspapers. I know you can't give us newspapers, but how about some books? Books, the commander repeated as he wrote. And what about letters? And Red Cross packages? George knew that this short turn of events wouldn't last, but figured it wouldn't hurt to ask for the moon, even if he and the boys only ended up with a few extra scraps. Letters, the warden said as he scribbled, then flipped his pad closed and slid it into his pocket. We will look into these things and let you know what we can do. We will do everything we can to take care of you properly. As the warden stood and walked away, Jake shook his head in disbelief and exhaled a cloud of smoke in front of his face. George looked back at Jake and shrugged. It was worth a shot. Jake sat hunched on the floor of his cell under his blanket, devouring a dog-eared copy of a well-worn book. There were no steak and eggs or letters or ice cream, but the 4 surviving raiders did start to get some bread, and for the first time received 3 meals a day instead of 2. A few old books were scrounged from who knows where and were circulated among the men. Stamped on the cover of the burgundy volume Jake was reading were the words, The Pleasures of Hope by Thomas Campbell, an epic poem first published in 1799. For the first time in many months, Jake drifted away to a better place. Primeval hope, the Aeonian muses say, when man and nature mourned their first decay, when every form of death and every woe shot from malignant stars to earth below, when murder bared her arm and rampant war yoked the red dragons of her iron car, when peace and mercy, banished from the plain, sprung on the viewless winds to heaven against, all forsook the friendless, guilty mind, but hope, the charmer, lingered still behind. Hope. It was the one thing that kept Jake hanging on. December 10th, 1943. Hopevale, the Philippines. Charmer handed Jimmy another section of woven mat to repair an outside window shade. Yeah, that fits pretty good. Jimmy tied the mat in with a strand of lacing, blinking hard as the sweat dripped from the brim of his hat into his eyes. As he reached up, he noticed how thin his arms had gotten and realized how pronounced the veins and sinews were. He was aging quickly. Mr. Covell? Jimmy and Charmer turned to 3 Filipina ladies standing behind them holding a handmade banner of woven palm strands. For your home, for Christmas. The ladies stepped apart and hung out the full dangling banner with the woven words, Peace on earth, goodwill to all men. Jimmy looked at Charmer with a beaming smile, then to the ladies. Why, that's outstanding! He reached out and examined the brilliant handiwork of the ladies who blushed with pride. How did you do that? It's beautiful, Charmer said. A gift for all you've given to us, a woman said with a smile. He looked into the ladies' faces with sincerity. Thank you. "Thank you. Here, let's put it up." He led the ladies to the front of their stilted hut and motioned to a place on their porch railing. "What do you say? I think it'd be perfect right here." The rain showers that evening fell steadily for hours, cascading off the grass roof of the Koval home and joining a soothing hiss of a million pats on the jungle leaves. A single kerosene lamp painted the room in gold as Jimmy held Charmer in his arms in a slow dance to White Christmas, crackling in on their radio, Charmer's new favourite song by Bing Crosby. Maybe they didn't have much, Jimmy thought, but they had each other, and he loved his wife. They continued their dance while trying to avoid the random leaks dripping through the roof. Charmer looked Jimmy in the face for a moment, smiled, put her head back on his shoulder, and wept. December 14th, 1943. 28 miles north of Hopevale, 260 Japanese soldiers and 115 local Filipinos forced into the search by the army spread across a clearing in the mountains. Behind them, clouds of smoke churned into the sky from a torched village. With his hands on his hips, Captain Watanabe squinted and scanned the hilly horizon from one end to the other. He uncapped his canteen and turned to his translator. "Ask him if we go this way to the American camp." A soldier swung the bayonet of his rifle toward an American slung between two Filipinos, placed the blade under his bearded chin caked in dried blood, and lifted his head. The translator leaned toward the American. The man was Lieutenant Albert King. Wounded and separated from his men, he was captured near a tributary of the Aklan River, a river that started high in the mountains and opened to the sea on the north side of the island. He was only half conscious. All of his toenails and fingernails had been torn out. Despite the fact that General MacArthur had sent communications to the guerrillas in the Philippines to cease attacks and to lay low for the time being to prevent reprisals by the Japanese, and that the guerrillas had complied, the Japanese command had issued a special order to seek and kill all Americans on the island. The past random hit-and-run tactics of the guerrillas had been highly effective and maddeningly frustrating to the Japanese. Now Watanabe could smell his hunted prey. "We head south, which way?" the translator said in English. "More to the mountains or toward the southeast?" Shigeru, the officer who had actually been to Hopevale and passed out currency, looked at the translator, then at the American, hoping he was too confused to know the way. King blinked slowly and swallowed. His eyes turned toward the lush jade ridges of the south, and he raised his head a bit in that direction. Watanabe stood erect, glanced back at his men, and waved them toward the southeast. December 19th, Hopevale. The warm, damp night air brought its own earthy scent and the familiar chorus of insects. The congregation of nearly 80 people sat quietly in the outdoor sanctuary under the glow of wicker lanterns scattered around the outside and down the centre aisle of the open church, hidden beneath the luan trees that vaulted into a cathedral ceiling. The stone seats all taken for this Yuletide event. Many stood along the sides, local Filipino husbands with their wives and children, working men, farmers, and guerrilla fighters, who had left their guns beside a tree out of respect. Jack stood with folded arms toward the back. Christmas being only a few days away, the community had decided to have one service in Hopevale that evening. There was never a sense of ownership or sectarianism among the people. It never crossed their minds. "This Christmas it would be fitting to read from the prophet Isaiah," Jimmy said as he stood at the front. A small stone altar displaying 3 candles beside him brought out the creases in his worn face. "The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. For you shall break the yoke of their burden and the rod of their oppressors. For every boot of the warrior in the battle, and the coat covered in blood will be for burning, fuel for the fire. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, the Prince." Jimmy looked up. And this prince won't be the kind who brings war or bloodshed, death or destruction. He held the book up before him and continued reading. He will be called the Prince of Peace, and there will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace from then on and forevermore. He nodded with a smile. Amen. The next day. High in the branches of a tropical tree, a Filipino teenager fixed his gaze through his binoculars in the afternoon heat. His friend below looked up anxiously, pacing and rubbing his hands. The lookout jerked the binoculars down, swung them over his shoulder, put his fingers to his mouth, and gave the familiar whistle of warning to all that Japanese troops were nearby, 3 times. He shimmied down toward his friend at the base of the tree. "They're coming from the north," he said in Ilongo as he struggled and leapt to the ground in a thud. "They're spreading out on both sides. Hundreds." The other boy nodded, and the two of them sprinted in opposite directions into the underbrush. Jack raced through the camp, holding his submachine gun tightly over his shoulder. He pounded his hand along the outside of Jimmy's hut as he ran. "Go, go, go! We gotta get out of here! Now!" Other guerrillas and the lookout called out as people sprinted and stumbled in various directions. Even the monkeys fled from the trees above. Jimmy limped to the doorway. "Yeah, okay, we're coming. Charmer, let's go." Jack looked at their weathered faces and torn clothes with a sense of foreboding. "Get in your cave. You'll be safe there. Go!" Frank and his wife trotted up, panting. "Ready?" Jimmy and Charmer stepped down from their hut and began their practiced routine, again heading into the woods barefooted, pushing the foliage aside as they ran, yet with far less energy than in the past. Jimmy could hear the soldiers calling to each other in Japanese and could make out words here and there. As Jimmy pushed through the leaves, he remembered that a few weeks earlier Reverend Dianala encouraged him and the others at Hopevale to split up, to seek higher ground, and to head deeper into the woods as he felt it was becoming less safe in the area, but Jimmy knew he was simply getting too weak. Frank Rose was nearly 60, and there were children in the camp as well. As he ran through huge ferns brushing across his face, he wondered if they should have tried to move. Charmer tripped over a vine and fell to her knees. Jimmy reached back, took her muddy hand and pulled her up, and they started again. "Matai!" 25. From a distance behind them, a soldier shouted again, "Tomaranta Utsuzo!" 26. A single round cracked from a rifle, echoing into the jungle canopy, sending birds in flight. 5 more soldiers joined him with their rifles pointing down the path. Violently gasping for breath, Jimmy, Charmer, Frank and Gertrude stood with their sweat-soaked backs to the soldiers and slowly turned. They could run no more. February 1944. Saipan. "In a few months," Nagumo said to Fuchida, "they're going to put me in charge of the Middle Pacific Fleet and the 14th Air Fleet. But with only anti-submarine craft and a few combat planes, my forces are completely inadequate to protect Saipan and the Marianas." Inside headquarters on the island, Fuchida stood beside his old commander, Vice Admiral Nagumo, as they both looked out the window, watching 2 Japanese fighters roar off the end of a dirt runway, lifting up over a tropical green cliff, then lofting above a turquoise sea. Fuchida felt the concern on Nagumo's face. "I've been promised troop transfers from Manchukuo, but they won't be under my command." Nagumo turned to Fuchida with penetrating eyes. "I need the 1st Air Fleet under my own command, but they won't give it to me. How can I possibly defend all these islands without it?" Nagumo was right, Fuchida thought. He was being given an impossible task, and he knew it. Saipan, the largest of the northern Mariana Islands, had become the center of a defensive line against the steady American advances, the last line of defense. If Saipan fell, the Japanese supply lines would be cut off, and the homeland would be within range of a new breed of long-range American bombers they'd been hearing rumors about and fearing. Fuchida wanted nothing more than to put Nagumo's fears at rest. As senior staff officer of the 1st Air Fleet, He knew exactly what their resources were, where they were, and most importantly at this moment, where they were heading next. "Sir, the 1st Air Fleet can move to any location they're needed as a single unit," he said, "but it can only be at one place at a time. What if it's needed somewhere else when I need it here? Then what?" Nagumo glanced uncomfortably at Fuchida, then back to the beach where sun-darkened, bare-chested soldiers poured cement for a nearly complete gun emplacement. The low, rounded structure with horizontal slits for machine guns was one of many defences rising around the edges of the tiny island. He had little confidence all would take place as planned, but desperately wanted to assuage his former commander's deepest fears. Nagumo's eyes surveyed the map, but Fuchida could see that his mind was 1,000 miles away. The days of triumph and glory at Pearl Harbor had been swallowed up by days of fear and doubt. The retreating empire of Japan was now under the growing shadow of a spectre that loomed larger every day, and the last flame of hope had finally flickered out of Nagumo's eyes. The Americans were coming with fury. He looked over at Fuchida's face as if he'd been given a death sentence, slowly stepped to the window again, clasped his hands behind his back, and gazed out at the exquisite aquamarine surf breaking onto the white sand beach. Chapter 88, February 22, 1944. Yokosuka Naval Base, Tokyo Bay. Clutching a clipboard, Fuchida strode briskly down the taxiway beside Genda past rows of Nakajima B-6N bombers straight from the factory, many being prepped by maintenance crews in white coveralls. Fuchida nearly shouted to Genda, "I have to leave tomorrow." Planes droned overhead as a cargo truck rolled past in a breeze of exhaust fumes and dust. "I'm off to Tinian Island, even though they're just beginning to prepare the 10 airfields in the Marianas. But those are the orders." Fuchida shook his head and held out his hand toward a new plane. "Brand new aircraft, but with brand new pilots." He came to a halt. 18 years old, I feel like I'm training schoolboys. We need more time." Rushed and overwhelmed, Fuchida knew that his best friend would understand. "We expected the Americans to attack Truk Lagoon," Genda said. "That was no surprise. We just didn't expect it so soon, just 2 weeks ago. It was a catastrophe that's shaken the High Command and forced their hand. The Americans have simply moved faster and more aggressively than we expected." It was a painful truth Fuchida hated to hear. The Americans. He warned his commanders and begged them to confront them before time ran out. "Preparations have to be made for a decisive battle," Fuchida said. "If we don't confront the Americans now, while we still have the strength to do so and before they can consolidate their power, we'll never be able to." They began walking again. "First, they want me to train pilots without aircraft," Fuchida said. "Then, when I finally have aircraft, they want me to send the pilots into battle without training. And with the bases in the Marianas incomplete, I have nowhere to send the aircraft." Fuchida stopped again, next to a pair of aircraft wings being unpacked from a crate. "We need at least 2 more months for vital training," he pounding his clipboard. "In a few months we can send out a devastating—" "Fuchi!" Genda waited until he had his attention and spoke softly but directly. "There's no more sand in the hourglass." A chill spread over his arms and back. Fuchida knew Genda was right but couldn't bring himself to admit it. It was sickening to think about. He looked off, far away, and spoke as if to himself. "And why do the Americans insult us with their demand for unconditional surrender? How stupid!" He looked back at Genda. "Surrender? They should know that this is a word we don't recognize." Genda nodded. After Pearl Harbor, it seems negotiate is a word the Americans don't recognize. The next day, Tinian Island, the Mariana Islands. 2 bulldozers and 2 graders stretched out a ribbon of dirt through the low scrub as 150 soldiers dumped wheelbarrows of gravel and raked the edges down. Fuchida pulled up to the side of the airstrip in a Kurogane with the top down, the Japanese 4WD equivalent of an American Jeep, with Vice Admiral Kakuta in the passenger seat. Coming to a stop, a cloud of dust rolled over them. Kakuta took hold of the metal frame of the windshield and pulled himself up to survey the project. Workers glanced up at the Admiral, then seemed to rake even faster. "This should have been completed a week ago." He glared impatiently. "And the third strip hasn't even been started." Fuchida stretched his neck as if he were searching. "Where are the fuel tanks? The sheet metal arrived here last week, but I don't see the welders." Fuchida opened his door and stepped out. This wasn't what he'd hoped to see, but instead what he feared most. Another Kurogane approached from a distance at a high rate of speed, bouncing and jerking right and left over the dirt shoulder until the vehicle came to a squealing halt beside them. Earlier that day, just before Fuchida and his group of aircraft arrived at Tinian, Kakuta had sent out reconnaissance aircraft 300 miles to the east and south. Lacking radar, it was their only hope for accurate intelligence on the whereabouts of the American fleet. A messenger leapt out and ran to Kakuta with a paper in his outstretched hand. "Admiral, sir, enemy sighted. Force includes carriers." Kakuta nodded, took the sheet and began reading as Fuchida got back in, slammed his door, and started the engine. The Admiral dropped back down into his seat. "The enemy will attack soon," he said, as Fuchida turned his Kurogane around and started back for headquarters. "Most likely tomorrow," Fuchida replied. He knew what Kakuta's impulse would be, immediate attack, but Fuchida knew that his immediate battle wasn't with the Americans, it was with his direct commander, Kakuta. "Admiral, excuse me, but I don't believe we should risk our forces unnecessarily. We have no fighters for cover. Just fly all the bombers back to Japan while they can still escape." They bounced erratically over the dirt road, racing back to headquarters. "Your caution sounds like cowardice. We have the advantage of surprise and can attack under cover of night. That's the job you were sent here to do." Fuchida restrained himself. "Sir, the pilots aren't sufficiently rested for an all-out battle with the Americans. We must have fighter escorts. Sending them home now will leave the enemy unscathed. I won't pass up the opportunity to attack the enemy and let them slip by. We will send out our aircraft tonight." The following afternoon, on the roof of the two-story headquarters, a utilitarian concrete structure streaked with rust, 3 soldiers silently peered through long-range binoculars on tripods as seagulls squawked above. Kakuta, Fuchida, and communication officers stood beside in the salty breeze, searching the empty, silent horizon. The muscles on the side of Fuchida's face flexed as he contemplated the mission of the previous night, when Kakuta sent out 27 of his bombers armed with torpedoes against the American fleet of unknown strength. 9 unarmed reconnaissance aircraft escorted them to help locate the target. Only 3 of these scout planes returned with unclear reports. None of Fuchida's men returned. He buried his fury. An aide stepped up the stairs and approached Kakuta. "Admiral, no radio communications received." The Admiral nodded without emotion. Fuchida fumed. He had vigorously argued with Kakuta that morning, but the Admiral insisted on sending off another group of 54 dive bombers, again with no fighter protection. It had been hours since they'd left, and if nothing else, they should have received radio communication from at least one plane. The sky remained empty. Nothing. Kakuta abruptly headed down the concrete stairs, directly followed by Fuchida, as he looked for an opportunity to speak with some measure of privacy. Kakuta knew Fuchida was on his heels and headed for his office, where Fuchida followed and slammed the door behind them. "I'm going to contact Iwo Jima," Kakuta said, reaching for the phone, "and have them send to us as many First Air Fleet fighters as they have, immediately." "Are you crazy?" Fuchida yelled, pushing aside all military decorum. "It's absolutely stupid to bring down planes from Iwo. They only have 27 fighters right now anyway. They'll arrive here exhausted, be thrown into the ring, and then be pounded to the mat by the Americans. All for nothing." Fuchida could see the pain and humiliation on Kakuta's face, and respected his willingness to engage the enemy, but this total lack of restraint in the face of appalling odds had to be confronted before any more lives were wasted. Fuchida did his best to regain his composure. "Admiral, I believe we'll have our chance, soon, but not now." Kakuta stood motionless with his hand on the phone. Part V. No Damn Hypocrite. J. Chapter 89, May 1944. Nanking, China. Jake wrung the mop strings with his bare hands into a tin bucket. It was a relief to have some work, anything other than just sit on his cell floor, so he took as much time as possible simply to have something to do as he mopped his cell. The guard looked in through the peephole. "Hurry up, number 5!" he shouted in Japanese. "Keep your shirt on, jackass!" Jake yelled back in Japanese as well. The keys jangled, the bolt unclicked, and the door swung open. His posture told Jake everything he needed to know. Get ready for a beating. Before Jake could dodge it, the guard smacked him on the side of the head, and Jake reflexively kicked the guard in the gut with his bare foot, shoving him into the corner. Snorting, the guard scampered to his feet, unlatched his steel scabbard, and landed alternating blows against Jake's back as he cowered in the corner. Jake stared down on his mop and bucket, then grabbed it and pitched the whole thing at the guard, hitting him right in the face with the mop. Stunned, the guard let out a string of what Jake presumed to be Japanese curses, then snatched Jake's mop and bucket, stormed out, and slammed and locked the door. Jake's head throbbed. The angry footsteps faded down the hallway. Jake stood silently panting, staring at the streaks of water dribbling down the wooden wall. He grinned. "Well," he said, "at least it wasn't another boring day." As the empty days dissolved one into the other, the only source of mental stimulation was whatever books were being passed around. Late that May, one day a guard knocked on his door. "Book!" Jake grabbed his copy of David Copperfield and slid it under the door to the guard. A few seconds later, another worn, dog-eared book was shoved back to him. It was a Bible. "Keep book 3 weeks," the guard said in English, then walked to the next cell. It was a book he never had much interest in. The only thing he really remembered from Sunday school was when the guy teaching talked about how he punched a hole in his muffler to make it louder. Jake always wanted to try that, never did. Now, though, under entirely different circumstances, he was intrigued. He had always admired his mother's sense of inner strength and gentle courage, and knew this water was drawn from a very deep well. When he heard a Bible was being passed around, he was more than curious and asked for a chance to read it. As long as there was enough light in his cell, he read and read and read. The hardest thing was finding a new position that didn't make his bones hurt. He lay on his back, on his side, and on his stomach as he went through every page. He kept asking questions, sometimes even repeating them out loud. "Come on! How could this be true? What's the proof?" After a couple of weeks, having read through every page, cover to cover a couple of times, he was drawn to the prophets, amazed by what they seemed to know. But he wondered how they could possibly know the future. "How could that be?" he said. "How could that be if God didn't tell them?" Lying on his stomach, he let the book fall flat. "So you still talk to people?" Jake looked around but heard nothing. I said, "So you still talk to people?" "Nothing." "I didn't think so." But the prophets seemed to know a lot about the future, and it seemed to happen, at least, according to the book. Things about the Messiah. A lot of little things about the Messiah. Jake started flipping back and forth between the prophets of old and the stories from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It seemed like the same things they said thousands of years earlier would happen, did happen. Born in Bethlehem, betrayed by his friends, pierced in his hands and feet, given vinegar to drink, a lot of things. How could this have been predicted if there wasn't a God to tell them ahead of time? How could it all be true? Or how could it all just be a big lie? He didn't know. When he looked at the part where Jesus was killed, He thought he would have said the same kind of things the people said. If he's really God, why doesn't he just save himself and get off the cross? It didn't make any sense. Time passed, and it neared the end of the 3 weeks for him to have the book. He came across the words of Isaiah the prophet, who spoke about a man of sorrows, suffering, rejected and despised. "Yeah, I know all about that," Jake said. But this time he noticed the words, "Our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. He was wounded for our rebellion." Jake felt a twinge of guilt. There were parts of his life he wasn't proud of. He still lied all the time to the guards. What impressed Jake most was the idea that love was the most powerful thing in the world. That's what it was all about. It would make the world a wonderful place if he could love people. If this God was real, he felt he had to listen to him, and he finally made up his mind he had to at least try. He decided he would do what God wanted if God made the way clear for him. Jake had one final request. He closed the book for the last time, stood up and stretched. All right. Just don't let me be one of those damn hypocrites. I hate those guys." May 1944, Keuka College, New York. Peggy excitedly walked down the linoleum hallway of her dorm, clutching her books in front of her with a letter propped in one hand. The year was almost over. Her whole education was almost over. There was a feeling of relief in the air. She wasn't going to miss the musty smell of that building. The future for her was wide open. She unloaded her books onto the desk with a thud and wiped her perspiring forehead with the back of her hand. She was definitely looking forward to not having to carry those around again. College had been more work than she thought, and she was finally going to get her BS in sociology. But it was bittersweet. She wished and really hoped her parents could have come to her graduation, but knew it wasn't possible. She was vice president of the YWCA, and the college had even given her the Esther Lyman Award. Her mum and dad didn't even know about it. She sat on the edge of her bed and ripped open the letter from her brother, David, hoping he had some news about their parents. He did. As she began reading the letter, her eyebrows came down. She clinched the paper harder. Flipping it over, her eyes darted across the page faster and faster as tears began rolling down her cheeks. Her hands trembling, the paper fell to the floor, and she collapsed onto her bed and wept uncontrollably. "Why? Why? Why?" Jean appeared in the doorway carrying her own stack of books. "Peggy?" Chapter 91. Morning, June 19th, 1944. The aircraft carrier Taiho, the Pacific Ocean between the Philippines and the Mariana Islands. On the flight deck of the carrier, as the wind swirled around him, Fuchida stood and watched another torpedo bomber flagged off to thunder into the brilliant sky. He'd recently been promoted to Air Operations Officer of the entire combined fleet. Looking to his left, another idling torpedo bomber inched into position in front of a group of 5 more rumbling planes. Another Zero fighter mystically rose to the deck on the rear elevator. The day had come. The Imperial Japanese Navy finally were having their decisive battle. The Japanese and the Americans were locking horns in the biggest naval air battle the world had ever seen. The sea was scattered with 9 Japanese aircraft carriers in 3 battle groups carrying 450 aircraft. 5 battleships and more than 40 other support vessels filled out the attack force. The Americans were thought to have 13 or 14 carriers and were limited to what aircraft they could launch from the sea. But Kakuta had arranged for 500 more planes to launch from Guam to join the battle, giving the Japanese nearly 1,000 aircraft to throw into the fight. But this wasn't the battle they had chosen. It was a battle that had chosen them. Fuchida had always been exhilarated to see and feel the power of these aircraft, especially on the deck of the newest carrier and flagship of Vice Admiral Ozawa, the Taiho, completed just 3 months earlier. Unlike the Akagi, which was converted from a battleship under construction, the Taiho was a new generation of Japanese carriers, built from the ground up to withstand torpedo and bomb attacks while still carrying on battle. But the exhilaration of the day was dampened with a far graver feeling than he had ever had before. Fuchida took a last look at the planes lining up and caught eyes with the bombardier in the middle seat, who enthusiastically smiled and nodded to him. Fuchida knew the feeling, but this was a young, inexperienced flyer, completely ignorant of the prowess of the American forces they faced. Fuchida smiled back, giving no hint of his uncertainty of ever seeing this flyer again. As he opened the door and headed to the command center, his smile immediately faded into a scowl as he walked down the freshly painted grey passageway. He was dogged by the thought that what had led to the beginning of the war was now leading to the end of the war. Oil. They waged war to get it, but without it they couldn't continue the war either. Now they had less than ever. 3,500 miles was a long way to haul oil from Indonesia to Japan, and there was no way to provide protection to their tankers from American submarines, which were biting off more and more of their supplies. New pilots couldn't be trained for aircraft, and ships couldn't be moved, all for lack of fuel. It was now clear to Fuchida and the Japanese military that the American strategy was to attack along two prongs. To the southwest, General MacArthur was leading his troops through New Guinea up toward the Philippines. To the northeast, Admiral Nimitz was leading the American Armada toward the Mariana Islands, most likely to establish air bases for the new B-29 long-range bombers to rain hell on the homeland of Japan. But they'd been uncertain where he was going to strike next. 3 days earlier, the Imperial Japanese Navy had their answer when 15 American battleships began hurling tens of thousands of 2-ton shells day and night onto Saipan. Fuchida entered a smoke-filled room, glanced at the blackboard scoreboard, then looked at a wall map as radio traffic sounded out from speaker boxes. Communication men with headsets scribbled notes as some marked tallies on blackboards and others pushed models on the sprawling map table. A wall clock showed 0995. As Fuchida studied the Marianas Islands on the map of the world, his eyes drifted across to France. 2 weeks earlier, the Allied forces turned loose a breathtaking assault on the coast of France involving 360,000 men and 5,000 warships. His eyes drifted over to Russia. That spring, the Russians had leapt onto the Germans with bloody vengeance, rolling over them with thousands of T-34 tanks. Japan's hopes had always presumed a German victory, now a discarded dream. In the previous 26 months, Japan had lost a full third of its entire air fleet, over 26,000 aircraft. Not only that, when Fuchida had recently sent for 100 of his best pilots from Halmahera in Indonesia to fly to the Marianas, fewer than 10 arrived. 10! Fuchida shook his head in anger. The rest were immobilized with malaria. Fuchida's eyes wandered to the floor and he mumbled under his breath, "God is not on our side." Fuchida proceeded to the blackboard beside the commander-in-chief of the carrier forces, Vice Admiral Ozawa, who stood 6 feet 7 inches, the tallest man on the ship. Privately among the shipmates, his less-than-stellar looks had earned him the ignominious nickname of the Gargoyle. Fuchida gave a quick glance. He didn't think he was that ugly. Examining the numbers on the board of airborne fighters and bombers, Fuchida lit up a cigarette. He knew this was their best chance to do serious damage to the American fleet, bring them to a halt, and allow an opportunity for a compromise for peace, a thought on the minds of all, but spoken by none. If the Marianas fell, it was all over. The Americans would load the islands with long-range bombers and pound the homeland into the sea. "Admiral," Fuchida said over the din of the room, "what have we heard from Vice Admiral Kakuta on Tinian?" An officer on a headset turned and shouted, "Second attack wave of 110 aircraft en route to the American task force. All aircraft airborne." "He's already sent out 2 waves with excellent results," Ozawa replied. "Early reports are several carriers on fire, perhaps 2 sunk. Severe damage to cruisers and other vessels." "Good." Fuchida was relieved and amazed. Their only ace in the hole was Kakuta's planes, the second prong of their own frontal attack, giving them an advantage. Without him, it would be a one-sided battle. Scouting reports indicated that the Americans had 3 or 4 battle groups of carriers, with perhaps 4 or 5 more carriers than the Japanese. Taking another long drag, Fuchida examined the board. Their 3 battle groups had launched the first wave of 69 aircraft at 0745 that morning, and they should be shortly arriving at the American fleet. The second wave of 110 planes had just been sent off. Kakuta was already engaging the enemy. Hundreds more aircraft were being readied for the third and fourth waves, and there'd been no sign of American detection of their fleet. As Fuchida took a puff of the last of his cigarette, he raised his eyebrows and gave a slight grin as a ridiculous thought crossed his mind. We might even win this battle. He folded his arms, nodded, and blew the smoke out through his nostrils. A massive shockwave thundered from below, dimming the lights for a second and ending all chatter. The bridge radio blared out. "Torpedo hit, for starboard." Ozawa looked grimly at Fuchida. He didn't have to say the words. Fuchida knew the commander wanted a damage report he could trust, so he nodded to Ozawa and made his way down the passageway to the upper hangar, dodging through the maze of dive bombers and engineers to the forward elevator, now jammed about 15 feet below the flight deck. Hurrying down ladders to the lower level, he saw Suwata mixed with aviation fuel bubbling up. After further investigation, he learned that the fuel tanks were ruptured, but the steel plates leaking seawater showed minimal damage. The hit seemed completely survivable. The new heavy plating had done its job. American torpedoes, Fuchida thought, were no match for Japan's Type 93, the best in the war. Many of the enemy torpedoes failed to explode, and once a Japanese sailor was rescued from the water while clinging to an American torpedo dud. He located the nearest phone and rang the command center. "Admiral, no serious damage. I advise we immediately board over the forward elevator and direct all aircraft to the aft elevator and continue flight operations." The Admiral agreed. Within 30 minutes, carpenters had dismantled galley tables and benches, covered the gaping hole in the flight deck, and the ship resumed flight operations. Returning to the command center, Fuchida continued to study the blackboard and monitor air reports. At 1000 that morning, 47 more aircraft sortied as the fourth wave of 82 planes prepared to launch by 11:30.